first session for the first ever Australian Symposium for the first ever Care Experience History Month was sensational. The theme was care and crime connections, and the presentations were excellent. If emotive, I did feel extremely sad at times about the way in which we have treated girls in particular, but children and young people in the child protection system. I also felt heartened by the end of the session, however, because I'm amongst allies, amongst people who do want to make positive change for the future. Our pleasure now to introduce the second session, which is First Nations children in the child protection system. And I guess, as everybody knows, Aboriginal children are abominably overrepresented in the Australian child protection system. Tim Calabria, our next speaker, has some really interesting ideas about why that might be. He's a PhD candidate at La Trobe University, where he won the Richard Broome Prize in 2017, and he's since won the Francis Forbes Society Prize for an article that he had published in Law and History, a journal. In 2020, Tim was able to gain an Australian Historical Association Copyright Agency bursary and mentorship, and he used that to develop the paper that he is presenting at this symposium. Welcome, Tim.
Well, thank you very much for introducing me so beautifully. I didn't realize that I must have been muted on the hardware. So I'll start again. Gorgeous, thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong and Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and future, who never ceded sovereignty to the lands that I live and work on. And I should note that the two stories of child abuse from bringing them home that I detail are disturbing. It's rare in Australia for people outside the public service to pay much attention to a government report, let alone for hundreds of thousands of people to take to the streets in response. Yet this is what happened in the wake of the 1997 publication of Bringing Them Home, otherwise known as the Stolen Generations Report. Over several hundred pages, it detailed the government policies that systematically took Indigenous children from their families from the 19th century until the 1970s. And these policies were set beside heart-rending stories told by people who'd been taken as children. Details from the report spread rapidly in public discourse, and controversially, Prime Minister John Howard responded by expressing his regret to the stolen generations rather than apologising. This refusal heralded a decade of fraught debate, millions of marching feet, and at least as many polemic words printed or spoken on the topic. This flurry of social movements only ceased when, in 2008, the new Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, delivered a national apology to the stolen generations as the first order of business under his government. Previous scholars like Penelope Edmonds and Sarah Ahmed have argued that the sorry books and reconciliation marches provided a closed circuit of emotional engagement with Australia's past, and these movements failed to affect the positive social change that had appeared to be on the horizon. Roseanne Kennedy delineates the positive, empathic responses to Stolen Generations testimony from negative responses like anxiety, anger, frustration, shame, and denial. In contrast, I'm going to argue that the reconciliation movement was characterised not only by catharsis, but also by the recathexis of meanings of Indigenous childhood and parenting. Widespread and bipartisan concern for Indigenous children, whether in the guise of compassion or pity, reinvigorated public anxieties about Indigenous children and resignified this population group to appear always already at risk from Indigenous adults who were increasingly pathologised in the period between 1997 and 2008. Based on my research, I suggest that in the decade after the 2008 apology, the endless dissemination of anecdotes and statistics depicting Indigenous children to be at risk fed into many people's schemas of Indigenous childhood. And it became possible for confirmation bias to operate in some social workers' decisions to remove such children from their families more frequently than they had previously. By the end of this paper, I'm hoping to prompt new questions about the why of child removal, past and present, while recognising that I can't definitively say that the discursive shift I describe has impacted recent removals. I'm making the case for considering this possibility and questioning it further. So the first section describes the sharp rise in Indigenous children being removed from their families between 2007 and 2017. The second section discusses what literature from psychology has to say about how minds can change when people are moved, and then briefly establishes how these theories can be integrated within a semiotics frame to describe why this discursive shift has occurred when it has in the way it has. The third section analyzes some of the text from bringing them home before finally discussing some of the impacts of the social movements it stimulated. So after decreasing from the 1970s to the 1990s, the number of Indigenous children in out-of-home care rose across Australia from 9,070 children in 2007 to 17,664 a decade later. The population of Indigenous children did increase by 40%, but removals increased by 95%. A recent New South Wales report, Family is Culture, found that, quote, children who did not appear to be at risk of harm were removed from their families, end quote, because of widespread non-compliance with policy. 1 in 4 children had been taken at birth or from the hospital soon after. Yet Family is Culture indicated no clear underlying motivation for the increase in child welfare workers' decisions to take children from their families, but perhaps an intensified impulse to rescue Indigenous children after bringing them home can help explain this. In explaining this intensification, I draw from Sigmund Freud, who observed that when a person experiences an emotion, an affective state, they tend to cathect or bind that feeling to a discernible signifier that they associate with the emotion, and they thus alter the meaning of that signifier due to their felt experience. In semiotics terms, the affect becomes an aspect of the signified. This is to say that if large numbers of people feel concern for Indigenous children, this will augment many people's schematic concern for them. And Freud's theory is supported by findings from clinical psychology. In the classical conditioning paradigm, affective states are understood as caused by an unconditioned stimulus, in this case, a harrowing story of an Indigenous child being abused. The affect subsequently becomes associated with a conditioned stimulus, which wouldn't otherwise cause that affective state. In this example, the Indigenous child becomes associated with the concern elicited by stories of abuse, even when the abuse is absent. And this is to say that by the time a person reaches adulthood, when their brain processes stimuli, it doesn't ask, what is this? It asks, what is this like? So through schema matching, emotion is processed efficiently, but not necessarily accurately. And as psychologist Susan Fiske states, when new information can be fit to old, affectively laden knowledge, then the person has available an immediate affective response when they match that schema to something. So Freud's cathexis and Pavlov's conditioning have different epistemological assumptions, but scholars like William Reddy and Jean-Paul Sartre neatly synthesize these fields. For example, Sartre dissolves the stimulus-response binary, recognizing that, quote, psychologists have noted that emotion is set in motion by a perception, a representation signal. But it seems for them that the emotion then withdraws from the object in order to be absorbed into itself. On the contrary, the emotion returns to the object and is fed there. So for Sartre, the stimulus doesn't cause the affective state, rather it constitutes it. When you reach out to embrace a threatened child, that child is present in your feeling of concern. The affect returns at every point to the child as that which you wish to rescue, as the source of your emotion, and that towards which your protective embrace is drawn. So if you recognize that the affected subject and the affective object are bound in an indissoluble synthesis, then it becomes simple to translate findings from psychology into a semiotics frame. But the overall point is that when people feel, minds can change. And when they do so en masse, certain discourses can become imbued with feeling. So when the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission published Bringing Them Home in May 1997, it confronted readers with harrowing stories of ruptured families and abused children. One anonymous interviewee, Millicent, found spent a quote, happy and harmonious child in a Yamachi camp behind Geraldton Hospital in Western Australia. But when she was 4 years old, the camp was dispersed by the Native Welfare Department, who institutionalised Millicent at Sister Kate's Children's Home in 1949. Never to see her parents again, she said of this time, I was so helpless and alone. In her first year of high school, the institution sent Millicent to work on a farm. There, she stated, the man of the house used to come into my room at night and force me to have sex. I tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. When she told the matron of the children's home, Millicent had her mouth washed out with soap, and she was sent back to that same farm the next year and told the inquiry that this time I was raped, bashed, and slashed with a razor blade. I wanted my mother to take me home where I'd be safe and wanted. After this second traumatic placement, Millicent returned to Sister Kate's and discovered that she was pregnant. Despite the non-consensual conception of the child, she stated that immediately after the birth, I was so happy. I had a beautiful baby girl of my own who I could love and cherish and have with me always. But the bastards took her from me. I didn't even get to hold her, but I'd always love her. They couldn't take that away. At the end of her account, the report notes that in 1996, after decades, Millicent was finally reunited with her daughter. The disturbing personal details of Millicent's oral history were not universally experienced, but the suffering and the structure of her story were reflected in other cases in bringing them home. For example, in Victoria, Paul was parted from his mother at 5.5 months in 1965. Paul's mother searched for him, but, quote, all her cries for help fell on deaf ears. When fostered out at the age of 5, he received verbal and physical abuse as the foster father would rain blows upon me with his favourite leather strap until I wept uncontrollably, pleading for him to stop. But his mother never stopped looking for him, and eventually, after turning 18, Paul became reunited with her. The stories of Millicent, Paul, and many others were preceded by sweeping histories of regional policies for removing Indigenous children from their families. The report's joining of the structural and the personal in this way invited readers to imagine these tragedies created over and over by a system which institutionalized despair. At the same time, bringing them home suspended people like Millicent and Paul before readers as a point of focus, like a figurative witness box, which rendered each witness an other, such that they stood in for the group Indigenous children. However much empathy and goodwill that bringing them home elicited, it produced the reference standing in for this population as a felt and known form of alterity. We feel sad about their suffering, an aboutness that ensures they remain the object of our feeling. It brought these people sharply into focus, but without personalized photos and with emotionally evocative accounts set beside structural histories, the storytellers dissolved into an amorphous element of language, a type or schema, which could be recathected by those encountering them. And there were many who did so. The report was a bestseller, and its findings were disseminated widely through a number of media. Bringing them home also included many statistics linking child abuse with poor health, education, and employment outcomes. And it stated that of the inquiry's witnesses, 29.6% of females and 10% of males in foster homes reported being abused, and that Indigenous people removed as children were 3 times more likely to have been jailed. And there are many more stats. I've put some of them on this slide for you. But this proliferation of statistics represented more than just describing the situation, represented a disquieting signifying chain with one negative outcome after another connected to the imagined adult future of the removed Indigenous child. A Bringing Them Home documentary video also played in schools around the country. At the beginning, Ronald Wilson quotes an Aboriginal woman saying, "I'm a rotten mother. I cannot cuddle my children because I never knew what it was to be cuddled." This powerful documentary reproduced the figure of the Indigenous child as at risk, even as it pathologized Indigenous parenting. It's garnered over 280,000 views on YouTube, to say nothing of its use in Australian classrooms. So this focus on issues in Indigenous communities extended to the ways in which people spoke about the report. As noted by the Social Justice Commissioner in 1998, in the 12 months following the publication of Bringing Them Home, discourses of Indigenous social pathologies became threaded throughout the emergent apology debate. By early 2010, as Social Justice Commissioner Tom Calma stated, one alarming statistic follows another in the constant study of and reportage on Indigenous Australians. After bringing them home, the circulation of such statistics, in addition to stories, associated child removal with social pathologies that ruined lives and continued to pervade Indigenous communities. As Nicholas Rose asserts, our images of political life are shaped by the realities of our society that statistics appear to disclose. In the period following the publication of Bringing Them Home, the proliferation of statistics emerged as integral to the social production of Indigenous adults as a community at risk of neglecting and abusing, and Indigenous children as a community at risk of neglect and abuse. When media commentator Prue McSween said publicly in 2018 that another generation of Aboriginal children needed to be saved from, quote, rape, assault, and neglect from Aboriginal adults, she justified her position by saying, quote, the statistics prove it. Bundjalung scholar Melissa Lukashenko observes that, quote, so much of modern Australian literature about us fixes upon our victimhood. And the same can be said of the narratives that emerged out of Bringing Them Home. And both sides of the apparently polarized apology debate, which I explore in a moment, increased public concern for Indigenous children, and this became a normative way of thinking and feeling, regardless of which position people took on whether to apologise. On the day when Bringing Them Home was published, it was released in 1997, John Howard stated that personally he felt, quote, deep sorrow for those who suffered injustices under the practices of past generations towards Indigenous children. But he also asserted that Australians of this generation should not be required to accept guilt and blame for past actions and policies over which they had no control. His failure to apologise was incredibly controversial, but there was no shortage of people who agreed with his position either. One, named Leslie Hicks, wrote to the Sydney Morning Herald in June saying, "I played no role in the program to take Aboriginal children from their parents. I don't believe I can be in any way held responsible." But like Howard, Hicks still expressed their condolences, quote, "for the behaviour of my ancestors, for this appalling and shameful miscalculation." Responding to the backlash in the following months, in January of 1998, the coalition member for Barker, Ian McLaughlin, wrote a letter to the editor of Victoria Harbour's Times saying that any sensitive person, myself included, feels deep sorrow about injustices suffered by Aboriginal Australians. But like Howard, he also refused to, quote, take responsibility. Howard, Hicks, and McLaughlin, along with many others, expressed regret and sadness as a response to the children's stories in Bringing Them Home. This enabled them to align as sensitive people who shared these feelings with most Australians, even as they refused to apologise and distance themselves from the people who'd caused the children harm. Many considered this position abhorrent, though, and an apology movement emerged. In May 1998, an estimated 500,000 people signed the sorry books that circulated through community centres, expressing their, quote, deep regret for the injustices suffered by Indigenous Australians as a result of European settlement. And they offered personal apology to the stolen generations. At least as many people marched for reconciliation in cities across the nation in the year 2000 and engaged in other movements as well, like the Sea of Hands. Recall that being moved in this kind of way can alter a person's emotional connection with, which is to say the meaning of, the thing that stimulated their affective state. The experience of an emotion while perceiving a stimulus can produce an enduring association between the stimulus and that affect. And that's what I'm suggesting caused a discursive shift, which augmented wholesale concern for Indigenous children in this period. Throughout the early and mid-2000s, debates continued to rage about whether to apologise to the stolen generations and whether child removal constituted genocide. Then, in 2006 and 2007, the public discourse shifted again as stories of Aboriginal adults abusing children in the Northern Territory became widely publicised, especially on ABC's Lateline and in The Australian. By the time that Little Children Are Sacred, a government report on child abuse in the Northern Territory was published in June 2007, feelings of concern, shame, and regret had become entangled with the figure of the Indigenous child. Tropes of Aboriginal social deficit associated with housing, education, and parenting were recirculated from the report, and this time, settler Australians were not implicated in the problems in the press. In response to Little Children Are Sacred, the government took extreme measures, establishing a kind of moderate martial law nominally to save children, with the blanket prohibition of alcohol, quarantining of welfare payments, and allowing police to enter vehicles and property without a warrant in Northern Territory Aboriginal communities. Such policies received bipartisan support and continue more or less unchanged into the present. When a new Labor government was elected in 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologised to the stolen generations, promising a new beginning for Australia and that the nation had turned a new page. His speech, like so many attempts at reconciliation, was emotionally profound for many Australians, but it did not herald positive change. Indeed, it coincided with the Northern Territory intervention, which I just mentioned, as well as the dramatic increase in removals of Indigenous children outlined at the beginning of the paper. The current situation of widespread removals without government directives has its precedents. In interwar Tasmania, racial bias operated through mainstream child welfare services to produce stolen generations, even though there was no formal policy to remove Aboriginal children. In Central Australia, as I've argued elsewhere, between 1914 and 1939, the forced institutionalisation of Aboriginal children did not rely on a policy framework. Policy followed sentiment, and the latter represented the foundation of the phenomenon. At this stage of study, the recent increase in removals is difficult to understand. But perhaps the recathexis of the figure of the Indigenous child during the social movements that followed the publication of Bringing Them Home produced a stronger impulse to remove Indigenous children, thus reproducing the mass removals that defined the era which Bringing Them Home and the reconciliation movement had promised to leave behind. In response to the questions the report raised, settler Australians tended towards outlets which offered solutions to affective discomfort, apologies and denials, which did not address the colonial condition at the root of their agitation. This is why Bringing Them Home could move bodies to walk bridges and sign books, but affected little positive political or social change. The flurry of reconciliation has since rescinded, but for many, the meaning of Indigenous childhood has not remained untouched. If the dramatically increased rates of removals are anything to go by, the reinvigoration of concern for Indigenous children has been dispersed through language and has come to operate at a multitude of sites. But this change, lingering at the borders of public consciousness, has not been for the better. Thank you.
I'm going to move now to the final presentations before lunch, which is a dual presentation. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Lena Turnbull, who holds an arts degree with a minor in Indigenous Studies and Social Work honours degree through Monash University. And Lena has worked as a social worker for over 10 years, as she just mentioned, primarily in direct practice, which is also known as case management, working with adolescents with disabilities and adults in the criminal justice system. And she has direct experience working with Indigenous young people transitioning from state care. Lena now works in tertiary education as a teaching associate and research officer within the Department of Social Work at Monash University. And Philip Mendez, who's very well known in the child protection academic research area. He teaches social policy and community development and is the director of the Social Inclusion and Social Policy Research Unit in the Department of Social Work at Monash University. He's been researching young people leaving state care for over 20 years, is the Australian representative on the Transitions to Adulthood for Young People Leaving Public Care International Research Group, and has completed major studies pertaining to youth justice, employment and mentoring programs, disability and Indigenous care leavers. He's the author or co-author of 12 books and many research articles, and I am not going to go on and mention all of those, but I recommend that you have a read of them. So let's thank Lena and Philip for their upcoming presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. We're going to share the presentation today, so I'm going to start. So I'll just share my screen, get it ready. And I apologise because our presentation is a bit more dry than Tim's presentation, which had some good images and personal stories to exemplify some of the things that he was talking about. But we are touching on what Dee said, which is what happens at the other end. So when these young people are no longer children and become adults. So before we get into the details, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all work and live today. For me, I live in the lands of the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation, and I'd also like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation, which are the traditional custodians of where Monash lives. I recognise that these lands were never ceded and a treaty was never reached, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And as social workers who do have a problematic history in removal of Aboriginal children, we acknowledge our sector's involvement in the pain and suffering caused to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. So this was a big research team that conducted this research, which I'm going to go into details in a minute. And so Philip and I were just two of the members, people from the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre, as well as SNAKE, the peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, were all involved in this research study. And I think we all brought particular strengths to viewing this issue and understanding it, and it really complemented each other in the course of the research. So our research was an Australia-wide study, and it's the first study of its kind which was looking at the Indigenous care leavers across Australia in each state and territory. So because it's the first study of the kind across Australia, we at this point we're looking to ascertain the number of Indigenous young people leaving state care, to document the existing policies and programs that apply to these groups across each state and territory, to gather some information concerning the outcomes for Indigenous young people, to identify any good practice that's occurring in this sector, and to provide some recommendations with regard to policy, program and service provision. So in this study, we looked at, we didn't actually speak to Indigenous care leavers themselves in this study, but we focused on talking to government departments, non-government organisations and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations from the leaving care sector and adjacent sectors where they worked with Indigenous care leavers. And we looked at topics around funding support programs, existing policies and policy applications, and the kinds of things that we've covered in the aims here. So through those interviews and focus groups, we came up with 10 key themes from the findings. So it was an extensive document. So I've tried to just summarise the key things which we feel are really relevant to policy and practice. So the first theme was around data. So problematically, we don't know exactly how many Indigenous care leavers transition from out-of-home care each year, but it's around this number of 1,140. So a significant kind of number. And we know already that Indigenous young people are overrepresented in all stages of care. So there were significant gaps in the data that was available. So it was around stuff like when and why did this group leave care and where did they go? And also some confusion around whether they left care because they reunified with their family, whether they left care because they absconded and, you know, they were just kind of lost in the system and not followed up. These kinds of questions make it really hard to even know how many young people are leaving care. And sometimes the states and territories will just gather data around a particular age group. So say 16 to 18, but we're finding that sometimes young people are leaving care as young as 14. The second theme was around funding. So the vast majority of the funding goes to mainstream NGOs, so not Aboriginal community controlled organisations. There are 3 states which provide funding specifically for Indigenous care leavers, not necessarily through ACOs, but funding which is specifically for Indigenous care leavers. But in total, that was less than 1.5 million across Australia. So what the participants were really telling us is funding is insufficient, it does not meet existing need, and it's kind of an opt-in basis. So if you know about the services and the funding and you opt in, you might have access to it, but otherwise you might not. And there's minimal accountability from NGOs and government around what they do with these services and the quality of these services. With regards to policy, there were some minor and lateral changes to policy, but no big shifts in policy. There were some good policy existing around, say, cultural plans and transition plans and the child placement principle. However, their application is inconsistent and minimal.
I think am I taking over from here?
I think one more slide for me and then you're next. Thanks,
right.
Philip. And I'll keep doing the slides for you.
Thank you.
So when we went into the policies in a bit more detail, cultural plans were seen as really essential for Indigenous care leavers, critical to their identity formation and kind of supporting them through that transition. But they were predominantly done by NGOs who didn't necessarily have that skill base and knowledge base needed. And so they weren't necessarily being done very well and often not at all. And it was recognised that good plans were done by Indigenous workers or ACOs who hold that special cultural knowledge. Transition plans, unfortunately, were similar. As we all know, care leavers often leave care without a transition plan. And this left Indigenous care leavers feeling ill-equipped to live independently. It was recognised that good transition plans would start early, around 12 to 15 years, but often they were done on the eve of an 18th birthday or not at all. And a really big theme was around service system failures, which I guess was kind of at the crux of what I was getting at with my question to Tim before about this kind of onus on individuals, but really we're working within a service system that has a lot of flaws. and may have racism, systemic racism within it. All the participants felt like the out-of-home care system, inclusive of leaving care, was broken. That was a word that was often used and driven by crisis. There were workforce issues, so unrealistic caseloads, high levels of stress and burnout, which is obviously impacting on that system's ability to provide care and support for Indigenous care leavers. It was frequently culturally insensitive, so that's on both an individual level and a kind of systemic level. And we did find people talking about this thing of unendorsed self-placement. So young Indigenous care leavers just kind of absconding or leaving care, reconnecting with family, but not in a way that is endorsed by the system, prior to the age of 15 years, which actually had this flow-on effect that they later may not be eligible for out-of-home care, leaving care support, because they were too young at the time of leaving care. So that's pretty scary. And there were some remoteness and language issues that had been noticed by service providers, which kind of acted as another barrier to meaningful engagement and service accessibility for Indigenous care leavers. And now I'll hand over to you, Philip.
Thank you, Lena, and hi, everybody. So theme 7, it was evident that ACOs are chronically underfunded, and a number of states and territories provide absolutely no funding to ACOs to provide leaving care services, and other than Victoria, the few others that provide funding, it is really quite short of what a proportionate funding would be. Despite that, ACOs tend to respond to needs of the young people like family. They often make themselves available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to support young people, and there is a lot of unfunded and unacknowledged work going on. We found that consultation, collaboration and relationships between ACOs and the non-Indigenous service sector are often poor, and non-Indigenous service providers regularly will struggle to collaborate with, recruit or support Indigenous workers and communities. Now, theme 8 looks at the key challenges facing Indigenous care leavers, and I guess one of the big issues here is, okay, what differentiates the Indigenous cohort, who are a very big proportion of the group leaving care and in care, from the non-Indigenous group? So many had poor experiences whilst in care, as in multiple placements, which had an adverse effect on their identity formation and leaving care outcomes. Reunification with family is crucial for Indigenous youth, but they are generally not receiving the support they need to progress that happening. Often for Indigenous care leavers, family responsibilities are part of their reunification, and an expectation is there that they will share housing with their community and or care for younger siblings, but government and private housing regulations often don't support that, and homelessness can become a common outcome, and when eviction notices occur, they then affect whole families and communities rather than just the individual young person. Poor transition planning can lead to Indigenous care leavers lacking core independent living skills when they graduate from care. Indigenous care leavers often have difficulty accessing and utilising education and employment pathways that can be affected by their mobility from one area of a state to another, or from one state to another, unstable housing and other factors. Female care leavers are particularly prone to experiencing early pregnancy and parenting, and when that happens, they are commonly under surveillance from child protection authorities and at a particularly high risk of their own children being removed and reinforcing intergenerational trauma. Many male care leavers with trauma-induced high-risk behaviours may cross over into the youth justice system. a history of surveillance by child protection and wanting to avoid welfare involvement due to the historical experiences of trauma from welfare can be a key trigger for youth and, in fact, their families disengaging from services. Diagnosed and equally undiagnosed health issues were said to be common, including mental health concerns, intergenerational trauma, learning difficulties, and others. And the Indigenous care leaver cohort tend to be particularly mobile, often moving between family and community networks. That might mean that they've been placed in a city well away from a rural family or community, or even in a different state. And the system doesn't support that mobility because leaving care services in every state and territory are very much state or territory based, and they generally don't recognise the need to support a care leaver from another jurisdiction. Now, moving on to theme 9, what is good practice? Lena talked a little bit earlier about the gradual development of extended care services till 21 years in most jurisdictions, and particularly Victoria has now established universal extended care till 21 for every care leaver, and WA has announced that they will establish that very soon as an election promise from the March election. 3 other states, South Australia, Tasmania and ACT, currently have some form of extended care, but the NT, Queensland and New South Wales don't. So there's a lot of evidence from international extended care programs and what has been happening as trials in Victoria and other states that that is a good way of improving outcomes. Equally, reconnecting and maintaining connections with family, community, culture and country is identified as something that supports resilience for Indigenous young people and can lead to successful transitions and outcomes. Indigenous community and ACO involvement in service provision is critical to success, particularly around informing and advancing cultural identity and connection. Culturally safe service provision is at the core of successful service delivery, and providing a holistic, friendly and flexible approach based on supportive relationships with workers and early and ongoing transition planning supports success. Finally, theme 10 around key participant recommendations at more of a macro policy level. There was a strong view that we need a nationally consistent approach to leaving care for Indigenous young people so that every state and territory has supports till 21 years of age, which will support and advance the option of mobility and equally focus on opportunities for early and ongoing reunification with family and community. Leaving care planning and processes should be embedded in every level of out-of-home care as a child or young person develops. Indigenous children should have universal access to culturally appropriate care, whatever jurisdiction they're in, whatever part of that jurisdiction they're living in, urban, rural or remote. And ACOs should be given true self-determination in policy and service development to deliver leaving care services to Indigenous children. And I guess I would emphasise, building on Tim's presentation, that there is arguably a really, really strong case for Australia to follow the USA, to follow Canada, to follow some of the developments in New Zealand, so that ownership of child welfare and child protection for our Indigenous population is handed over to Indigenous communities. Finally, moving on to recommendations. So The first one very much is an overriding one, that the entire out-of-home care sector, in care and leaving care, needs to embrace a greater awareness of the ongoing intergenerational trauma and socio-economic disadvantage facing Indigenous communities, and utilise that understanding in their decision making and their service delivery. We strongly believe a National Commissioner for Indigenous Children should be appointed, who will cover leaving care and post-care, as well as out-of-home care, and a national approach, as I said earlier, to out-of-home care support be adopted. ACCO should receive proportionate funding to support Indigenous children's connection to family and community whilst in out-of-home care, given that Indigenous children are now around 40% of the group in out-of-home care. ACCO should receive adequate and proportionate funding to generate and apply meaningful transition and cultural plans. And ACCO should receive proportionate funding to support reunification for Indigenous children once they have exited care. There should be a housing allowance for all Indigenous care leavers to access culturally safe housing, which reflects the particular cultural and community needs of that cohort. And finally, the annual Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Child Protection Report should include reliable statistics on all care leavers up to 21 years of age, including a discrete section on Indigenous care leavers and their outcomes in all the key areas, including health, mental health, education, employment, housing, and so on. So for more information, a copy of our full report is available on Australian Policy Online. There are shorter, very short summaries of our findings in both the conversation and the Monash University lens. There is also a long article in Children Youth Services Review, which we can certainly share with anyone that would like a copy of that. Just copy either myself at that email address or Lena at her email address. Thank you very much to Dee and the audience, and Lena and I are very happy to take on any questions or comments.
Thank you very much.